So to get started, some introduction. So my name is Ken. I am the Director of MCAT for MedSchoolCoach. If you're not familiar, MedSchoolCoach, we are a very unique company that helps students with every aspect of becoming a physician. So one of those aspects is helping students with the MCAT exam. So we're going to discuss later that we have a fantastic team of MCAT tutors who have all scored between 520 to 528 on the MCAT, and they're very good at helping students improve their scores or reach their target scores. More on that later. In terms of my own background, so I have been helping students with the MCAT for over a decade now, for about 11 years. For the first 5 years, I was actually with the Princeton Review, where I was a senior MCAT instructor, premier tutor, and instructor trainer. That means I used to fly all across the country training new individuals to become MCAT instructors for the Princeton Review. And just over 6 years ago, I was recruited by MedSchoolCoach to start our own MCAT division. So we've been here for quite a while now. So again, really happy to share a lot of good, useful information from MCAT. And with me is our Associate Director of MCAT, Alex. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Ken. Happy to be here. Glad to see everybody. So I have been in sort of the MCAT sphere for about 8 years now, starting my own journey with taking the MCAT and preparing for it. And I've been teaching and creating content ever since. Like Ken, I've been sort of around the block with test prep and exam prep companies, and have been with MedSchoolCoach for about 4 years now. So.
Great. So of course, we're going to be talking a lot about the MCAT and how to get a 99th percentile MCAT score. But of course, we need to start by discussing what exactly is a 99th percentile MCAT score. And then we'll talk about how you can get a 99th percentile MCAT score. And along the way, perhaps how MedSchoolCoach can help you get there. So to start off, in terms of a 99th percentile MCAT score, part of this is understanding statistics, right? So percentile is really your performance compared to everyone else. So for example, if you have a 60th percentile score on an exam, that means you scored higher than 60% of all test takers. So what that means, of course, is a 99th percentile MCAT score is an MCAT score that is higher than 99% of all test takers, which is also to say you are the top 1% of all students taking MCAT, which is not easy to achieve. And if you want to know what that is, you can actually see it here because this is data directly from the AMC, the creators of the MCAT exam, showing the distribution of MCAT scores from the most recent data from the AAMC. And you can see that the MCAT follows a normal distribution or a bell curve. So what that means is that most students are going to be scoring close to around the middle, around the average of 500 or approximately 500. And very few students are going to be scoring exceptionally high, right? So as of now, as of 2024, if you want a 99th percentile MCAT score, that would be an MCAT score between 522 to 528, right? So that's the definition of a 99th percentile MCAT score in the MCAT. Let's now talk about, do you need a 99th percentile MCAT score? And you've probably figured out that you don't, right? There are plenty of students who get into medical schools with a 99th percentile MCAT score, and plenty of students who get in without a 99th percentile MCAT score. This table here has some really useful data. Again, it's straight from the AMC. And what this table shows is what percentage of applicants with different GPA and MCAT combinations were accepted to medical school. So for example, let's say you have a 3.5 GPA. All right, so your GPA is between 3.4 to 3.59, and you score a 507 on the MCAT. Well, you can see that you fall right into this cell where 33.6% of students were accepted to medical school with that MCAT and GPA combination. So now that you understand how to read the table, you can probably figure out that the higher your numbers, the higher your chances of getting accepted. And that's absolutely the case. And you'll notice, though, that even if you are at the highest in terms of MCAT and GPA, right? In this table, if your GPA is greater than 3.79, if your MCAT score is greater than 517, it's still not 100%, right? And that's because of a lot of what you just heard from the deans in the last presentation, which is numbers are important, right? You need to score well on the MCAT. You need a high GPA. You want to do as well as you can there, but that's not your whole application, right? They're going to look at your application holistically. They're going to look at your experiences, your personal statement, your letters of recommendations, and all of that. So keep in mind, numbers are important, but they're not everything. But your goal, of course, is to get as high of an MCAT and GPA as possible. Now, when I'm looking at this data, one question that I often get from students is, if I have a high GPA, can I get away with a lower MCAT score? Or vice versa, if I have a low GPA, can I compensate that with a high MCAT score? And you can actually see that looking at this table, right? So let's say you've done fantastic at your university, you have a great GPA, right? Greater than 3.79, but you've got a below average MCAT score, right? So we said earlier, average is around a 500. So below average, maybe you scored between 494 to 497. You can see that only 17.1% of these applicants were accepted, right? That's not great, which unfortunately means if you've got a high GPA, you can't really get away with a low MCAT. You should really just retake the MCAT and get a higher score. And that's actually another point I want to emphasize, which is if you look at this table, just look at the difference of improving your score by a few points, right? If you improve your score by 2 to 3 points, you can increase the percentage of applicants who get accepted significantly, right? 11%, 12%, 15%, 14%. It's really, really meaningful to improve your MCAT score by a few points. Now, that of course means if you've got a high GPA, low MCAT, you should really plan on just retaking the MCAT. Let's consider the opposite situation. Let's say you've got a really, well, let's just say you've got a below average GPA, right? Let's say you've got a GPA of 3.1. For medical schools, a 3.1 GPA is definitely on the lower side, right? So you got a 3.1 GPA, perhaps because the first couple years of university was a little tough, right? But despite having a lower GPA, you crush the MCAT and you get a score greater than 517. You can see that 52.6% of those applicants were accepted to medical school, which certainly means if school is a little tough for you, you have to take some time to adjust and learn how to study to raise your GPA, but your overall GPA is still on the lower end. You don't have to feel that you can't get into medical school because you can see this data from the AMC. If you're able to crush the MCAT, get a score greater than 517, you've got a great chance just looking at the numbers. And last point that I really want to make just looking at this data is, yes, you can see how important the numbers are for applying to US medical schools, right? And I did see a couple questions in the chat. This is for total GPA, right? So this is for everyone who is applying to allopathic or MD medical schools, right? So this is not for osteopathic or DO medical schools. Those numbers are slightly different, but they're not too different, right? It certainly follows the similar trends to what we see here. All right, so hopefully by taking a look at this table, you have a sense of, based on your situation, what might be a good MCAT score for you to aim for, which is likely as high as possible. From here, we're going to talk a bit about how can you actually achieve a 99th percentile MCAT score? And the goal is not necessarily to say that you have to do the same as these 99th percentile MCAT test takers, but if you're able to understand how these students get high scores, if you can at least try to simulate or emulate some of that in your own studies, that can certainly help with your preparation as well. And the first step here, and Alex is going to talk about this, is the importance of creating an effective study plan.
Thanks, Ken. So I'll start by saying that I have worked with one-on-one with tutoring and teaching with a lot of students that end up in a 99 or something similarly high. And I find a lot of their habits to be very similar. And one of those is not just having an effective study plan, that's one thing. You can get help and craft a fantastic study, but if you can't stick to it or recover if you have a hiccup in the study plan, continuing to be very organized, well, that effective study plan is no longer effective, right? So one of the habits or trends that I see in high performing students and certainly in our tutoring team is a good plan overall in the sense that they have enough time to complete everything that needs to be completed. So we need to have certain periods in our study plan where we focus on certain tasks. Typically for an effective study plan, and let's think maybe a 5-month study plan for like an average student. So you want to have a month or two where you're just relearning the content that you have probably forgotten. General chemistry, what is an acid, what is a base, right? Things like that, where you want to read through your old textbooks, read through, and
Oh, I think we're having slight technical issues, but just to continue the point that Alex was talking about is when you're studying for the MCAT, keep in mind that it tests a lot of different semesters worth of science content, right? You've got general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, biology, biochemistry, psychology, and sociology. For a lot of students, by the time you study for the MCAT, realize that some of those classes, such as general chemistry, you probably took several years ago, right? So because of that, when you're creating your study plan, you do want to make sure that you're reviewing those previous subjects that you've taken. You don't want to think of the MCAT as, hey, I've got these courses I need to take. Once I've taken these courses, I'm ready to take the MCAT, right? There's a lot of these subjects that you've learned before, but you've forgotten because it's been years. So what we mean by that is, in order to succeed on the MCAT, one of the most important aspects of MCAT preparation is content review. You have to spend a lot of time reviewing the science content that's tested on the exam. And we just said one reason is because some of the science content you've learned years ago. Another reason actually is that the curriculum of your college courses is not the same as the curriculum of the MCAT. So what I mean by that is there's going to be some science content that's tested on the MCAT that you've never learned about before. And because of that, you still need to spend some time learning that material because it wasn't covered in your college courses. Now, for the MCAT, knowing the science content is great, but realize that just because you know the science content, you've got the science content memorized, doesn't mean you're going to get a great score. And the reason why is because the MCAT is not a test of rote memorization. It's not simply asking you, hey, do you have this fact memorized or do you have that fact memorized? The MCAT is a test of application. Can you apply your knowledge of the science content to the passage text? So because of that, you need to review the science content, but you also need to take a lot of practice exams and complete a lot of practice questions, right? Those are really the two halves of an effective study plan. Make sure you're doing content review and make sure you're doing practice. And one thing that we highly recommend students is not to just say, okay, I'm going to review science content and I'm going to do practice, because that sounds very simple, but to actually map it out on a study calendar, right? So if you look at this slide, you can actually see an example of a study calendar that we use to build study plans for students. And it's a spreadsheet. And the nice thing about a spreadsheet is that we're able to map out for each day of the student's MCAT preparation exactly what they need to do for their studies, which chapters from their MCAT books they need to review, which practice questions they need to complete, which flashcards and videos they need to review. And by building out a very detailed study plan, it makes sure you know exactly what you need to do for your studies from the day you begin your MCAT prep until test day. All right, so I hope that information was helpful. The next thing I actually want to talk about is a special promotion for those of you who are joining us today, right? So I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about your MCAT preparation. That's why you're here for this webinar about the MCAT. So one product that MedSchoolCoach actually offers is a mobile application. So for any of you who want to get started early with your MCAT preparation, if you just go on the App Store on iOS devices or the Google Play Store on Android devices, if you look up MCAT, you're probably going to find this app as the #1 app. And that's because we're the highest rated app. We've got over 1,000 5-star reviews. And what this mobile application contains is hundreds and hundreds of videos covering the highest yield science content on the exam. It also has lecture notes, flashcards, and question banks to help you reinforce the information. And as a special thank you for those of you who are joining us for this presentation, we're actually going to be giving a special offer where you can sign up for lifetime access to our MCAT prep app for $89.99. So if you actually check the chat, I'm going to be dropping in a link. You can go ahead and click on it. And if you click on this link, you're going to be able to purchase lifetime access. And we really do mean lifetime. So this is actually a really good opportunity for those of you who, maybe you're a freshman, you're not going to be taking the MCAT for a few years, but you want to have an app, you want to start your MCAT preparation early and start reviewing some of the science content on your free time. Right? So it's a fantastic app. Highly recommend that you check it out. And I should mention, in the last slide, we were just talking about how to create an effective study plan. This app actually has a built-in study plan. So it can help you figure out at what pace do you need to watch and review the videos to make sure you go through all of the content by test day. And this offer, I can see a question in the chat, this offer is only for today. So please make sure you sign up by today or tonight at the latest, because otherwise the link is going to expire. So again, it's a special offer that we're providing as a thank you for joining this presentation. And we're now going to continue talking about how to get a 99th percentile MCAT score. So the next topic is, we said earlier, if you want to prepare well for the MCAT, an effective study plan has two parts: content review and practice. But you probably recognize it's not just about doing content review, right? Like if you take your books and you just flip the pages and skim through it, that's not really doing content review properly, right? Proper content review means actually reading your MCAT books cover to cover, taking notes, highlighting to make sure you're actively reading the text. You're doing the practice questions in the text and making sure you understand the information. The same is true for practice. And Alex, perhaps you can chat a little bit about how to effectively complete practice questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm back. Apologize about my technical difficulties, but practicing like a 99th percentile student, the common theme with students that are scoring in that range is that they practice correctly. You might be thinking, well, duh, that makes a lot of sense, right? And it does. So I'm going to go through sort of what that looks like. Now, you might have heard this sort of old idiom that practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect, and that's very, very true. So what that's going to look like is simply doing practice problems. You can only do the best that you can in the moment. And then the real magic comes in after that, which is going to be the review of the topic. So there are a lot of components that go into answering an MCAT question. This exam is nothing like school exams or even other standardized exams you've taken, like the SAT or the ACT. Very, very unique. There's a very strong logic component to it. So part of our task during review is parsing between what is the topic, do I know the topic, and then the application of it and the use of logic or scientific critical thinking. When you're able to separate those two and properly analyze both, you can really start to make a plan on how to improve in either area. Let's say that you were to miss a question, and after looking at it, you realize, I really just don't understand thermodynamics. So your task would be to make sure that you understand thermodynamics. So with an attitude that you're going to learn it to a degree now, that you'll never miss another thermodynamics question based on content ever again. So that's a very lofty goal, but it is a helpful attitude to take when you're reviewing your exams. The logic component, the test taking component, the scientific reasoning component, that can be a little trickier. And thankfully, a lot of practice questions that you can obtain actually provide a lot of insight into how to think like a test maker and how to apply scientific critical thinking to these questions. Now, I will say that these are skills and abilities that take time to develop. And I usually recommend to people find a mentor or a tutor or somebody at least that has taken the MCAT and has scored in a range that you would love to get to, and ask for help. Figure out how they're thinking, adopt their thought processes, because if it worked for them and you can understand that, well, then it's going to work for you. So that's my best advice in practicing with an percentile student.
Great. So the next topic I want to discuss is a lot of students know it's important to do practice. And yes, it's important you do practice. It's important that you simulate test day conditions. But something that's also really important is making sure that you're properly reviewing practice exams, right? So let me tell you about a scenario that I hear about all the time from students, right? Often I'm having a consultation with a student and they're telling me, hey, I've been studying for an MCAT for several months. I've taken a few practice exams, but my score won't improve. I feel like I plateaued. I scored a 502, then a 500, then a 501, then a 500. I'm just stuck at the score range, right? And if I'm being completely honest, anytime a student takes multiple practice exams and they keep getting the same score over and over again, it's really because of one reason, and that is they're not adequately reviewing their practice exams. And that's because if you're reviewing your practice exams properly, you should be learning from your mistakes. And if you learn from your mistakes, you should not be making the same mistake on subsequent practice exams. So then your scores will be able to improve. So here, there's 3 questions that we often have our students go through to make sure they're reviewing their practice exams properly. So the 3 questions are right here, and afterwards, Alex and I are actually going to go through examples of how to use these 3 questions to analyze actual MCAT questions. So the first question you need to answer is, why did I get this question wrong? And you have to be honest with yourself, because if you don't understand why you got the question wrong, you're not going to be able to figure out what you have to do differently to make sure you get that question right next time, right? And that's the next step. How do I get this type of question right next time? And if I missed the question because I was lacking content knowledge, what content knowledge was I lacking? Right? So these 3 questions, incredibly important to make sure that you are able to review your practice exams properly, learn from your mistakes. So now let's go ahead and take a look at an example. And for this example, this is a practice question. This is an MCAT practice question. So this is actually a nice opportunity for all of you to give this a try. So go ahead, read this passage text. Of course, I'm not giving you the full passage because we don't have time for that, but read this paragraph of text, take a look at this question, take a look at these answer choices, and go ahead and let us know in the chat what you think the correct answer is. And then Alex will review it shortly.
So the first thing that we should do is and this is every question you ever answer for the MCAT, is check in with yourself to make sure you understand the question. This one, thankfully, is really straightforward. We're simply thinking about how paragraph 2's argument is going to be structured. Now, my advice, looking at the answer choices just very briefly, you can see that they're long. So I'm going to recommend you first sort of collect your thoughts around what is the argument. And then if you want to, if you have the time, you can think in general what would strengthen that. So let's just identify the argument real quick in the paragraph. To sum it up, McCain and Palin were the choice for the Republican Party in 2008, and the claim is that it weakened the position of liberal conservatives, and that the financial sector didn't like it. Now, of course, we have some explanation further on as to why the financial sector, or some proof that the financial sector didn't like it. They funded the other guy. That's pretty good proof that they didn't like the Republican Party's candidates. My thought to that argument is, well, why didn't they like it? And if we were told why the financial sector didn't like this this choice of McKean and Palin, the argument would make a lot more sense. It's okay as is, but it would be a lot stronger if we understood why. So that's what we should expect to be in the answer choices. And it actually does end up being A. And it shows that this would be a good explanation as to why the financial sector wouldn't like it, because they have a policy that is radical and leading them away from liberal conservative. So that further weakens that position. Now, I know that a lot of people chose C. I saw a lot of C's coming through the chat, and that makes sense. C is a very good, attractive trap answer, but we already have sort of a description as to why the financial sector backed Obama. It was because they didn't like McCain and Palin as candidates. It's simple as that. So, yeah.
Great. So one of the things that we actually want to think about, and oops, let me try to get to the slide, is actually thinking about those three questions, right? So let's say a student got this question correct and the student got the question wrong. We talked about those three questions earlier, right? Why did I get this question wrong? How can I get this question right next time? And of course, this is CARS, so there's not really this content knowledge. So Alex, any idea how a student could perhaps reflect on this question to try to get this type of question right next time?
Absolutely. So you want to check in with yourself in the thought process. And the first thing that you do when you answer a question, again, is to understand the question. A lot of students just read question stems passively and sort of just stumble into the answer choices and make a mistake. That's really common. We've all been. But checking with yourself, did I understand the question? And then you check in with yourself, did I understand how to answer the question? So if you ran into the answer choices and just picked the first thing that you remembered about the passage in the answer choices, which again is common, you'd want to think, how can I not do that? And then you want to come up with a solution. My recommendation, if that was the error, is to do what we did when we went through that question, is to first come up with sort of your own idea of what could answer the question. And it was really simple. We just wanted to know why the financial sector didn't like McKean and Palin. There's also other things. For example, let's see with C, a good takeaway, a good review takeaway for this would be to double check the passage to see if a description was already there. So that'd be one way to review C, and that's another way to be able to get this question right in the future.
Great. So that was one example. We're now going to try one more example. This one was for CARS. Let's now look at a science example, right? So this is a freestanding question, which means it's not associated with the passage. And the question is, if a transmission electron microscope uses a diverging lens with a focal length of 2 centimeters, what is the power of this lens? So again, go ahead and take a few moments, think about this question, and let me know what you think is the correct answer, and we'll go through the same review process as we did earlier. And again, go ahead and write what you think the correct answer is in the chat. So between A, B, C, and D. You're asking what a diverging lens is. It's probably a little early for you in terms of your MCAT prep. So you might have to wait a few years until you've taken physics, because at that point, you should know what a diverging lens is. All right, so looking at the chat, I'm seeing a lot of the same responses, a lot of people voting for C, which I hope you're arriving at that answer by yourself and not because you're seeing everyone else pick C. But yes, if you have not taken physics, you probably can't answer this question at this time, unfortunately. Okay. Oh, yes, I did see some Ds as well. So I think we're dominated by Cs and Ds in the chat. All right, let's go ahead and talk about how to answer this question. So to answer this question, there's actually a number of different steps that you have to take here, right? Which is number one, recognize what the question is asking you, right? And also be able to understand if you miss this question, what is really the thought process here, right? So the first thing that you actually need to know for this question is that what is this question asking you for? It's asking you for power, right? So that's the first thing you have to recognize. Hey, they're asking you for the power of a lens. So the first question you should be thinking about is, do you recall what is the equation for the power of a lens? Well, the equation is power equals 1 over focal length, right? So first of all, if you got this question wrong and it was because you didn't know this equation, you didn't have this equation memorized, well, you've already answered the questions we talked about before, which is, why did I miss this question? Well, it's because I didn't know the content. How do I make sure I get this question right next time? I memorized this equation. And what was the content knowledge I was lacking? This equation, power equals 1 over focal length. But that, unfortunately, is not the only thing you needed to know to answer this question. You also needed to know that this question is asking specifically about a diverging lens. And you need to know that geometric optics that are diverging, they have a negative focal length. So that's another piece of knowledge. The third piece of knowledge is you have to see here that all of your different answer choices has units of diopters. And you have to remember this capital D, which stands for diopter, this unit is equivalent to 1 over meter. Now, why is that important? Well, it's because the focal length that you were given here was in centimeters. So you have to remember to take this 2 centimeters and convert it to meters, which would be 1 over 0.02 meters. And from there, okay, sorry, it's 0.02 meters. I'll skip you a step. 2 centimeters is 0.02 meters. So finally, you can plug this all together. Power equals 1 over your focal length. Your focal length is negative 0.02 meters. So we want to plug that in here. Power equals 1 over negative 0.02 meters. So a couple things. Number one, you know it's negative, so that allows you to eliminate choices C and D because they're positive. The next step is, in terms of A and B, you do need to make sure you can do this calculation. Now, for some students, when they look at these numbers, 1 over 0.02, they're a little unsure how to deal with the fractions. They're a little unsure how to deal with the decimals. So one simple solution is actually just multiply by tens until you get rid of the decimals, right? So 1 over 0.02 is also 10 over negative 0.2, which is also 100 over negative 2, which gets you the correct answer of negative 50 diopters. So the correct answer is A. Nice job to those of you who got A as the correct answer. The point that I'm trying to convey here is there's a lot of different steps that you had to take to answer this question, right? You had to know the equation for power. You needed to know that diverging optics have a negative focal length. You needed to know what the unit diopter is, and you also had to be able to do the math. If you simply look at a question and read the solution, you haven't done this analysis to figure out which of these steps did you not understand and is what caused you to miss that problem. So if you answer the 3 questions we discussed of why did I miss this question, how can I get this question right next time, and what content knowledge was I lacking, that's how you can make sure you improve your score. And of course, many of you have probably realized at this point, hey, this is science content I haven't learned about before. That's fine. You'll take physics later. You'll learn some of this material. Some of you are probably realizing, hey, I've seen this before, but I've definitely forgotten it, right? That's actually another important aspect about the MCAT, which is making sure that you memorize the science content, right? And in terms of memorizing the science content, repetition is extremely important, right? A common example is the amino acids. Realize that with amino acids, it's not something you can simply spend a weekend memorizing and having it memorized forever, right? Chances are a week or two later, you're probably going to forget the amino acids. So 2 weeks later, you have to review it again. A month later, you have to review it again. There's a lot of science content you have to review over and over again. And that's just the nature of how MCAT preparation works. Now, one thing that can really help you with reviewing the science content is what we actually have here on the slide. And before I talk about MCAT Go, I want to point out this thing over here, which is the MCAT Basics podcast. So I'd like to ask, for those of you who are here, and there's a lot of you here, let us know if you are familiar with the MCAT Basics podcast, if you enjoy the MCAT Basics podcast. If so, please do let everyone in the chat know about the MCAT Basics podcast. And of course, if you haven't heard of the MCAT Basics podcast, I would highly recommend for you to go into the podcast app on iOS devices or go to Spotify, Stitcher, any app with podcasts. And if you look up MCAT, you're going to find the MCAT Basics podcast. And yes, I'm glad to hear several students in the chat, Marissa, Prachi, Nithemi, you've all heard of the MCAT Basics podcast. That's fantastic. It's a really helpful podcast. And what it is there was a pre-med student, Sam Smith, who, while he was studying for his own MCAT exam, realized that a really helpful way for him to study for the MCAT is to create podcasts on the highest yield science content on the exam. So he created all these podcasts. They are completely free. You can check them out. And a lot of students really enjoy this podcast. And for those of you who enjoy this audio learning, you'll actually find that it's quite convenient because you can listen to it on the go, right? If you're commuting to work, if you're taking a walk outside, if you're doing chores, if you're at the gym, and you just want to do a bit of light MCAT studying, listening to MCAT audio content is extremely helpful and a nice way to lightly review for the MCAT. So again, highly recommend you check out the MCAT Basics podcast. And if you enjoy it, I'd also recommend checking out MCAT Go. So Sam Smith, I mentioned earlier, he created the MCAT Basics podcast. But when Sam Smith was actually applying to medical school, he came to work for MedSchoolCoach, right? And in that year he was working for MedSchoolCoach, he took the MCAT Basics podcast and created MCAT Go. MCAT Go is a premium version of the MCAT Basics podcast. There's probably 30 to 40 episodes of MCAT Basics. There's 300 to 400, the precise number I think is 378 episodes of MCAT Go. So if you really like the MCAT Basics content, you should certainly check out MCAT Go. And what I'm going to put in the chat, again, just another thank you for those of you joining us this evening, is a special code that you can use to try out MCAT Go for your first month for $1, right? And normally the subscription is $99 per month, but if you want to check out MCAT Go, see if this is something that you might enjoy for your MCAT preparation, you can certainly check it out. And also I do want to mention, I've seen in the chat multiple mentions about the MCAT Prep app. These are different, right? The MCAT Prep app has videos, right? Videos, practice questions, flashcards, lecture notes to help you review the science content. MCAT Go is in a purely audio format. So they're audio lessons just like podcasts. So they're different ways, and usually students have a preference, right? Some students are more visual learners, so they prefer watching videos. Other students, they like the convenience of being able to listen to audio on the go. So that's the difference between the two. I also know that there's been a number of questions about the MCAT Prep app. For any of you who sign up for the lifetime subscription, you will receive an email later today or sometime after you sign up, an email from me with instructions for redeeming access. Okay, so the next thing that I do want to mention is we've discussed a lot about preparing for the MCAT, but realize that the process is a challenging one. For a lot of students, studying for the MCAT can be kind of an isolating process because they feel like they have to study by themselves, right? They think studying for the MCAT means sitting in the rooms locked up for 3 months for the MCAT, but that's not really how MCAT studying has to be, right? Yes, there are a lot of students who self-study for the MCAT and they do perfectly fine, but there's a lot of other students who realize that when they're trying to figure it out on their own, it's just a really difficult process. It's not great for their mental health. And they also don't know if they're studying properly for the MCAT, right? So if you're a student who feels a little lost with the MCAT and you want guidance, or if you're a student who knows you want that 99th percentile MCAT score, I'd highly recommend that you work with an MCAT tutor from MedSchoolCoach, right? I mentioned earlier, we've got a bunch of MCAT tutors who have all scored between 520 to 528 on the MCAT exam. They're not just good test takers, they're also really good educators, very effective at communicating their knowledge of science content and test taking strategies to students. Plus, we've achieved incredible results, right? So if you look at the average baseline score of our students, which is either from a previous MCAT exam or from a practice exam you take at the beginning of your studies, if you haven't taken the MCAT before, compare that with the final score on test day, our average score improvement is 10 to 12 points. And that's honestly quite incredible, right? If you remember that chart I showed earlier, if you improve your score by just 2 to 3 points, that really increases your chances of getting into medical school, right? So a 10 to 12 point improvement, that's huge, right? So for anyone who's interested in working with an MCAT expert from MedSchoolCoach, you can actually use this QR code right here on the screen. You can use your phone, scan it, and you can book a free consultation with a member of our team. And we'd be happy to chat with you about how MCAT tutoring can help you with your MCAT preparation. In addition, you can see in the chat that we have a link. So if you're on your phone right now and you want to click that link to book a meeting to talk about MCAT tutoring, you can use that as well. And I see a question asking if we have a score guarantee. So we have a score improvement guarantee, all right? So that means if you're looking at your starting score versus your final score, if you do not improve your score, there is a score improvement guarantee that we offer, right? And the guarantee that we actually offer, it's not like a lot of companies out there. And I say this because I used to work for one of those large companies where they say things like, oh, you've got a 515 plus score guarantee, but then you read the fine text and it's honestly not really a guarantee, right? Most guarantees put in so many rules and restrictions. And if you don't follow all of those rules and restrictions, the guarantee doesn't actually apply, right? So for us, our guarantee, it's an actual guarantee that we've applied to students who don't improve their score, right? Now, I'm also being honest with that, which is to say that not all students who work with us are able to improve their score on the first attempt. And that's just the reality, right? If you ever speak to a test prep company and they tell you all of their students improved by 20 points, they're probably lying, right? So there are some students who find out about MedSchoolCoach a little too late, right? So sometimes a student will come up to us and they say, oh, I've got 2 weeks before my test date. I want to sign up for tutoring. You have to be a bit realistic with that, right? If you've been studying for the MCAT for 5 months and you finally want to ask for tutoring in the last 2 weeks, there's not much we can do in that last 2 weeks, right? So for some students that find out about us too late, they do have to retake the MCAT. We still apply the score improvement guarantee, but we make sure for that retake, there's a real plan to make sure that next attempt, they've got a good plan to make sure they reach their target score. I also want to mention, this is also the time of the presentation where we're going to be answering your questions. So I know in the Q&A, there's a lot of questions that we can probably help answer. Please feel free to submit additional questions there. But I want to emphasize again, for any of you who are interested in working with an MCAT tutor for your MCAT prep, feel free to book a meeting with us. And with that, I think, Alex, we can probably take a look at some of these questions. So I think this first one's pretty good. So the question is, why are there so many resources for the MCAT? I'm scared that I'm going to make a bad decision and purchase the wrong resource, all right? How many resources should we have? Alex, if you want to share your thoughts there.
Definitely. So on some level, the answer to your question of why there are so many resources is because of the complexity and difficulty of this exam. There are a lot of people out there that have worked with companies or started companies because they truly want to offer a product that will help you. So that is a very good reason why there's a lot of resources out there. The other reason is that everybody learns a little bit differently, or they have their sweet spot with how they learn. For example, audio. Ken talked a lot about MCAT Go and MCAT Basics podcasts. I know if something like that was around when I studied for the MCAT, I would have been the first one to sign up for that audio because I was on the go so much. That fit with my lifestyle fantastically. And to speak to the concern about making a bad decision, I see that a lot because there are a lot of, I don't want to speak too poorly about some of the options that are out there, so I won't say anything specifically, but there are a lot of not great options that don't really care to match the actual exam. And so you do want to be very careful. You want to look at reviews and things like that. But the best thing that you can do is to get help from somebody who knows and has used and is familiar with a lot of the options that are out there, and they won't steer you. So that would be sort of the shortcut in picking the best options for yourself.
Great. And I'm seeing a couple of quick questions that I do want to answer, right? Which is number one, is there any way to prepare for the MCAT if you're a high school student? I'm going to be honest, if you're a high school student, you first want to make sure you get into a good university, right? Do everything you can, make sure you get in a good university. And even if you are in university, if you're a freshman, you should probably not focus too much on studying for the MCAT, right? You should really focus on doing well in your college courses. And then if you have any spare time, right, if you want to do some light studying on the side, you can check out our MCAT prep app, right? That's a nice way to just get your feet wet with about the MCAT, but really wait until later for the focus of your studies. Now, the other question I saw was kind of similar, which is for a student who's looking to take the MCAT in January 2025, when should they start working with a tutor? When should they start their MCAT preparation? So I will say that most students will study between 3 to 6 months for the MCAT. If you're studying over the summer, you can study 3 months full time and be ready for the MCAT. But if you're studying while in classes, right, with many activities and extracurriculars, you'll need more time than that. So many students will start 6 months before their test date. So if you're looking at January, you can look at starting your MCAT prep around August, right? So that's most students, 3 to 6 months. Another point that I'll make is that that's the average, but many students will actually start earlier than that, right? I already said, don't start as a freshman, that's too early. So when is the earliest you might want to consider starting your studying for the MCAT? Well, the earliest you might want to start studying for the MCAT is a year in advance, right? That's the earliest I would recommend a student start their MCAT preparation a year in advance, right? So if you're looking at taking the MCAT in January 2025, if you want to start your MCAT preparation, you're able to do that now. And yes, I do see other questions about the MCAT prep app. You will receive the email soon after this webinar. So please make sure to watch out for that email. And Alex, here's another question for you. Let's see. We actually have a lot of questions. Let me try to find one that applies well to a lot of students. Okay, so a lot of these are asking similar questions with regard to when you should take them. Maybe we should talk a little bit more about that, right? So yeah, Alex, do you want to share your thoughts about, your recommendations of when a student should take the MCAT and when they should start their prep?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. For most students, between 3 and 6 months, and what that looks like is a consideration typically about how much do I have going on. So if you're taking classes and working full time and only have 10 or 12 hours a week to put towards MCAT studying, yeah, it's going to take you a long time to get ready. It's going to take you a long time to get ready. But if you have, less months, but you can really do it full time, then you can get ready much sooner. And that's the reason why I usually talk in hours. And I find that most students uh, typically are fairly inefficient right at the beginning of their MCAT prep. So it takes a little bit of time to pick up speed, and that's okay. You just have to sort of plan. And then also some hiccups along the way. So it's really important to build in some buffer time. All that being said, I would think about 500 hours for most students to get to their goal. Whether that's your 99th percentile and you're starting starting with a little bit higher of a score, or if it's a more reasonable score and you're starting a little bit low, usually about 400 to 500 hours.
Great. And I do see a question in the chat for a student who hasn't taken a course yet, right? Physics. And also, I just want to make a note real quick. It is preferred that you submit your questions using the Q&A feature, because I will tell you, we're getting hundreds and hundreds of questions, right? So we're not going to be able to answer every single question, but if we don't get to your question, if you put it in the Q&A feature, we will email you a response to your question. If your question's in the chat, that may not happen, right? But the question is, for students who aren't able to take all of the prerequisite courses before the MCAT, for example, let's say you're not able to take Physics 2 or Biochemistry before the MCAT, can you still start your MCAT prep? The answer is absolutely. But the thing you have to think about is exactly what is your situation going to be on test day? For example, let's say you want to take the MCAT in January 2025. That physics class you haven't taken yet, are you going to be taking it in the fall, right? Because if you're going to be taking it this fall, that's perfectly fine, because you will have reviewed and learned the physics content in that class before you take the MCAT in January 2025. Now, that's not a problem, but if you're not going to be taking physics until spring of 2025, that does make the situation more difficult, because that means you're not going to take that physics class before the MCAT, and that means you're going to have to learn the material on your own, right? That's not so easy to do, right? For some students, they can open a book and they can review the information easily because they've learned it before in their college courses and now they need to review it. But if you've never learned physics before and you're trying to read the book, a lot of it might be gibberish. So in a lot of those cases, there's going to be students who will actually work with an MCAT tutor to have the tutor teach them that science content to bring them up to speed, right? And an example I have is actually a student who I worked with who was a non-traditional student, right? So this student didn't major in the sciences. She was an English literature major, and she was several years out of school, decided that she wanted to go into medicine. So what I did was I taught her all of the science content she needed to know from scratch, so she was able to succeed and do well in the MCAT, and she ended up with a 522 on her exam, which is fantastic.
Awesome. This was such a fantastic session all about the MCAT. We just heard so much excellent information from Dr. Tao and Alex, who are really experts when it comes to the MCAT. Like we heard from the deans just in the last session, the MCAT and GPA and overall the application is just so important. So we're so grateful for these experts on the MCAT from MedSchoolCoach to come on, tell us more about it. And like we were saying, you know, there's so much information out there. There's so many resources. Ultimately, there's just so much value to be able to work with somebody who can tell you specifically how to prepare and what really it takes to do well. And so this session was amazing. I know if you want to speak with somebody like Dr. Tao or Alex, directly to them even, you can book one of these meetings and we can help you get in touch. MedSchoolCoach has been awesome for helping out. And so this session was incredible. Our next session is going to be directly hearing from current medical students. So Dr. Tao, Alex, thank you both so much for being on this session. We're seeing in the chat that people are thanking you as well. This was such valuable information. And again, if you want to book a meeting to speak with, you know, an advisor specifically directly, whether it's for applying to medical school or for tutoring, you have that QR code right there. And I think in the chat as well, it's been dropped. You guys have been awesome for staying on for so long during the day. We know it's a long day with a lot of information being shared. So